Good morning. My name is Vida Williams, and I am the Chief Data Officer, Chief Diversity Officer for SingleStone Consulting here in Richmond, Virginia. And today I thought that I would give a few observations that I've had over the past year in occupying both the Chief Data Officer position as well as the Chief Diversity Officer's position, both as a consultant into larger organizations and as those roles within our smaller organization. One of the things that drew me to data 25 years ago is its very intimate, non obtrusive way of telling a story. I know that may seem weird given how we perceive data engineering as a mathematical, alchemaic magic, but for anyone who has spent hours culling and wrangling data, the intrigue is the glimpse into the human experience that it allows. Intellectually, I think that makes sense because in each industry I support, I'm asked to create data enterprises that will predict and pretend human behavior. We call this practice advanced analytics, machine learning, artificial intelligence, in order to put some skill set and distance between us and our spy like activities. But in most industries, this is what we're doing. We're assessing human behavior and interactions with our products, our services, and our companies. In the spirit of honesty and disclosure, I will say that I think what makes me good at my job is that I am keenly aware of what I am doing. I spend time with my teams explaining the need for discretion, governance, contextualization, and temperance in our daily work. We must honor the human story even as we transcribe it into algorithms and graphs and other pretty visualizations. One important distinction is the awareness of assigning importance to characteristics that are outcomes versus indicators. What do I mean by that? Well, let's look at our current pandemic. Black Americans were disproportionately affected by COVID-19. That sentence by itself suggests that melanin must be a factor in the communicability and the resiliency to the virus. It isn't. What the data suggests is that individuals who lack access to healthy food choices, healthcare, and education, compounded by the systemic trauma of economic instability and insustainability for at least one generation, are going to be more susceptible to this and other pandemics. In this particular case, race and ethnicity are algorithmic shorthands for telling that complete story. Many people have asked, why did SingleStone Consulting merge the roles of data and diversity into one person for progress accountability? Those who shape the story we tell ourselves shape our future state. In our industry, we call it data-driven behavior change. Anyone who has ever looked at their watch in an effort to close their rings has experienced data-driven behavior change. In 1896, it was statistically justified that Black Americans were uninsurable. That data-driven decision led to financial redlining, which led to the trauma in economic sustainability for groups of people. Data-driven behavior change, when done nefariously or neglectfully, can have catastrophic effects on the collective. Consider some of the impacts of affirmative action in the 1990s and the effects it has had on institutions and people. There are anecdotes of Black and Brown Americans and of women not being deserving of the positions that they held, but instead having only been accepted or hired to satisfy as many variables as possible. I would happen to know that because I checked a few of those boxes myself in the 90s. If this is not our path forward, then what is? Hence the intrigue of being both Chief Diversity Officer and Chief Data Officer. How do we responsibly use data to affect society and the collective and our institutions for change? I would argue that the first way we do that is by establishing context. We are ultimately telling stories. Check and double check the context from which you are culling your data. in the enterprise wherein you are organizing your data. Please do not tell me Black, brown, and female technologists do not exist. I know for a fact I am not a unicorn from fairyland. I am also not standing around waiting for you to hire me. I am choosing to work for companies and stakeholders who accept me with equity and who will benefit from my skills, my experience, and my personal insight, my personal story. In other words, the object is to find out where we are as opposed to where we are not. It's establishing the context for where we exist. Secondly, the right variable definition leads to the right policies. The right policies lead to the right variable definitions. There are centuries of variables, features, nomenclature, which has been codified, sans validation with wrong definition and including bias. We have an opportunity to recontextualize and rename, dare I say, even eradicate some of these variables. For example, maternity leave implies that fathers do not want to or they are not needed in the bonding and nurturing process of new family members. It does not consider the newborn or the adopted child's or the family addition's needs at all. Instead, it is a fiscal algorithm variable for forecasting impact of losing a resource productivity for 2 to 6 weeks, depending upon your policy. Furthermore, the decision to make it more inclusive and equitable between men and women, maybe calling it family leave, particularly in the workplace, will ultimately be considered an increased expense in the data financial sets, therefore impacting whether or not there is policy adaptation and adoption through the organization. That is the implication of data-driven decision making. So right variable with right definition is important for establishing how and what decisions are made, when they're made, by whom they're made, with what impact. Third, and my last point, right behaviors to change. I could have said appropriate behaviors. Right seems like perhaps it's a little judgy. But when we consider that most of societal isms are fostered in fear, if we are going to become equitably diverse, we must positively incentivize inclusion, particularly through the eradication of fear in the workplace. Increased communication and engagement eradicates fear. That does not sound like a data-driven behavior change, however, does it? Ironically, data can only impact behavior after the framework for impact has been established. Again, it goes back to that magical alchemic mathematics that people tend to think that we do. The interactions and engagements that have to be defined and executed in order to capture the data. Your desired healthy steps must be determined before capturing the total number of steps you just walked, or else the steps themselves are meaningless in your watch. If we create the frameworks for communication and engagement that include measurable as well as qualitative factors, the interaction model will collect data points that will indicate progress, i.e., promotions. If you have a positive outlier, figure out what enabled that and build that into your framework. Likewise, if you have a negative outlier, figure out what didn't work and adjust accordingly. I suppose what I'm suggesting from experience is that data practices are not mathematical alchemic magic. What we do, when done properly, will explain our human experience and interaction within the context of change. As executives, we define the frameworks of change wherein we must invest and commit to the framework in order for the data to indicate progress over time. That was the fatal mistake to the tech diversity efforts of 10 years ago. But I will say this, it is only when we make that investment and that commitment that I will cease to be an anomalous data point. And then maybe, just maybe, I won't actually have to add the diversity title to my data title. With that being said, I know that was only a 10-minute talk, but I wanted to make sure that I had ample time to address any questions that may come from the audience, which is something I generally suffer from because I tend to be loquacious. So I'm going to pause. We have 10 minutes to open this up for discussion, and I would be happy to share any insights I may have gathered over the past year occupying these two positions in probably one of the most volatile times, unstable times that we have experienced, both in the industry of technology, but in the industry that is our country. So I am looking through the chat. Yeah. How do I, Eric Sims asks, how do I recommend addressing microaggressions in the workplace? The way that we have addressed those, Eric, is by doing active communication and collaboration workshops, where we, on one hand, define what a microaggression is, but more importantly, we actually work with our team members on understanding polarities and then understanding their positioning in polarities, and then uncovering a language to deal with those polarities, most importantly, dealing with the listening aspect of it versus that hardcore taking a position and holding the line, because that has been kind of the ecosystem of communication that has led to many of the miscommunications that we have seen, and the misunderstandings. So we didn't actually really hone in on microaggressions. We defined it, and then we worked at understanding a different mechanism for communication across the organization and across the company. So hopefully that makes sense. What is your advice for someone who has put his first step into data science? I tell my first step is always make sure that you have your skill set built around, mathematics and data modeling and those types of things. But the one thing that I suggest that many others of my peers maybe not suggest so much is take a social science. Make sure that you're taking a social science, whether it's psychology, sociology, or one of those other types, so that you can begin to understand and indicate what the data is actually standing for. Without the understanding of human context, the data is meaningless. And so it is equally important to have that context and to understand how to be insanely curious about that context in order for the data to actually be powerful when you report it back out. So I hope that answered that question. Camilla, do I have any insights on outcomes from anti-racist data-driven initiatives? Honestly, Camilla, those are so new. When we started defining anti-racism, this in 2020, right, which is where that term really took root with definition, I think it was the first time that we understood that perhaps when we say there should not be any discrimination, instead of just putting one more thing that we shouldn't discriminate against. Oh, we shouldn't discriminate against religion. Oh, we shouldn't discriminate against race. Oh, we shouldn't discriminate against ethnicity. Oh, we shouldn't discriminate. How about we just say we don't discriminate? Right? How about we codify that? And so I think in that we have finally gotten to that place where we are willing to go out on a limb as a society and say, how about we just don't discriminate? Now we have a framework within which we can begin to harvest data elements that both support but also, as I said earlier, will indicate a negative outlier to that support so that we can then adjust the framework. But this one is so new, and it's such a new way for us to be able to think about it. And I think it is because, and I'll share, being an interracial woman born in that loving generation, I think for me, one of the exciting things is to see that there's every single person in our society is now touched with some type of diversity. There are, interracial grandchildren running around. There's a gay daughter in your family. There's, an immigrant that has married into your family. And so the concept, the framework that supports anti-racism is now possible because we're not so binarily associated with a context that is just Black and white. So that's the beauty of where we are right now, but we don't have a measurable for it just yet. Similar to talking about COVID-19. Being Black didn't make me more susceptible to COVID-19. It was all these other indicators that made Black Americans susceptible to COVID-19. So I know that's me walking away from a definitive answer, but I hope it was at least helpful. Nelson, how do you balance your data role and diversity role? People of color in tech have not only performed their day job day to day, but often are asked to do additional duties like outreach, sit on panels, don't directly help. Look, man, that is the question. So the way that I balanced it was what I would consider a very forthright manner. First, I asked for my senior leadership team to acknowledge that they are asking me they're putting the burden on the victim to change the crime, if that makes any sense as an analogy. And I wanted us as a senior leadership team to acknowledge the potential challenge that was going to be for me. That not only, that my entire career has been based on the fact that I am a really smart person, but all of a sudden what you're asking me to do is really show up as a Black woman. You've been telling me for 20 years, don't show up as a Black woman, only show up as a smart person. And now you're asking me to show up as a Black woman. So if I'm going to do that, then everybody else must show up authentically as themselves as well. And my senior leadership team acknowledged and accepted that challenge together. Because we were willing to acknowledge and accept that challenge together, I felt supported, and I was given the opportunity to think creatively about how we might create an infrastructure where being authentically oneself is the moment of power and accentuates the skill sets that we can bring to the table. And now we just need a framework to communicate it. So that's how I went about balancing these two roles, by asking for and expecting equity and acceptance and shared responsibility for the outcome from everybody that sat at the table. I think we need to do more of that, because across the country, we saw a big pickup in the number of people of color who were asked to take on these roles to reset a culture for an industry, for their institution. And if we are not aware that we are putting the burden of correction on the people who are hurt by the institution, then we are doing a disservice, and we will not actually change the institution at all. We'll just put a Black face on it. And we don't want to do that anymore. It's too painful. I hope that answered. I hope it wasn't too personal. How do I connect diversity mission? How do I connect to diversity mission, Greg, and what tools help? I think what it really is for me, Greg, is not actually divorcing the mission itself. What it is for me is just making sure it's part of the enterprise. We are human, and throughout this enterprise, we're going to be human. And I am 3 minutes from the end. I thank you so much for attending my talk. I look forward to seeing you guys in virtual spaces. I'm on Twitter. I can be emailed. I'm on LinkedIn. Please make sure you connect with me. I'd love to talk with you more about this journey I'm on. Have a great rest of your conference.